As the country debates how schools should teach the role of slavery in our nation's history, author Clint Smith is taking a critical eye to how it's being portrayed at some important historical sites. His new book is How the Word is Passed, a reckoning with the history of slavery across America. Smith describes his visits to places including Virginia's Monticello, Louisiana's Angola prison, and New York City. He examines how they confront or fail to confront their pasts. Smith shared an excerpt from the book during a recent visit to Washington, D.C.'s African American Civil War Museum and Memorial.
Part of what I love about this monument and this memorial is that it pays tribute to a collective group of people. Sometimes in the early stages of the book, I would come down here and just think about all of the people who fought this war to make sure that my ancestors wouldn't remain enslaved, and that I am part of a long lineage and tradition of people who fought for freedom and fought for liberation and fought for opportunities that they knew they might not necessarily see themselves.
The history of slavery is the history of the United States. It was not peripheral to our founding, it was central to it. It is not irrelevant to our contemporary society, it created it. The history is in our soil, it is in our policies, and it must too be in our memories. In order for our country to collectively move forward, it is not enough to have a patchwork of places that are honest about this history while being surrounded by other spaces that undermine it. It must be a collective endeavor to learn and confront the story of slavery and how it shaped the world we live in today. We can learn this history from the scholars who have unearthed generations of evidence of all that slavery was, from the voices of the enslaved in the stories and narratives they left behind, by standing on the land where it happened, by remembering that land, by marking that land, by not allowing what happened there to be forgotten, and by listening to our own families, by sitting down and having conversations with our elders and getting insight into all that they've seen. At some point, it is no longer a question of whether we can learn this history, but whether or not we have the collective will to reckon with it.
And Clint Smith joins us now. Good morning, Clint. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let me start with the question you asked at the end there. Do you think this nation does have the collective will to reckon with this history?
I think we're moving towards it. I think we certainly have a long way to go. I think if we consider where we were several years ago, I think that our country has a much more sophisticated understanding, at least many people do, of how racism and the history of racism is not just an interpersonal phenomenon, but a historic one and a systemic one, and one that is embedded into all of our social, economic, and political infrastructure. And I think that we are developing a better understanding, a better framework, and a better language with which to make sense of why the contemporary landscape of inequality looks the way that it does today, and how the reason one community looks one way and another community looks another way is not because of people in those communities, but is because of what has been done to those communities generation after generation after generation.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating read because the history is taught somewhat differently in the sites that you go to, more honestly in some places than others. One place you go to is New York City, which I only learned much later in my life, was where the economy of slavery was central to the economy of New York City. But you point out largely how important it was to the U.S. economy. This blew me away. By 1860, the nearly 4 million enslaved people were by far the country's most valuable economic asset, valued at about $3.5 billion. They were worth more than all the country's manufacturing and railroads combined. I had no idea, I'll be honest.
Yeah, I think a lot of people know in the abstract that slavery was central to the economic infrastructure of the country in the 18th and 19th century. But historians like David Blight, who I cite there, really emphasize that, again, in 1860, the 4 million enslaved black people were worth more than every bank, factory, and railroad combined, worth more than all of the manufacturing in this country. And I think it's important to recognize how the labor and forced exploitation of millions of enslaved people is quite literally part of the reason why the United States exists as a global economic superpower today.
Clint, I want to second what Anthony said about I had no idea. I had spent some time in Monticello with Ta-Nehisi Coates, who was doing research for his book, The Water Dancer. And one of the tour guides told me that when people come to visit, white visitors in particular, they either get very angry because they said, we didn't come here to hear this about Thomas Jefferson's history. Why are you telling us this? They're either mad or they're either shocked. And you talk about a conversation with two women, Donna and Grace. Could you talk about that? Because I think that's pretty typical of how people feel.
Yeah, so I went to Monticello, and Monticello has several tours that one can take, and one of them is focused specifically on the history of slavery at Monticello and focusing on Jefferson's relationship to slavery and also the experience of the enslaved people who lived at Monticello. And so I was on this tour led by a guy named David Thorson, and these two women, Donna and Grace, were on the tour as well, and I was watching them during the tour as David was discussing Jefferson's relationship to slavery, and their mouths were agape. They were clearly unnerved, and I went up to them after and asked them what they thought, and they were like, I had no idea that Jefferson owned slaves. I had no idea that Monticello was a plantation. And mind you, these are people who bought plane tickets, who got hotel rooms, who rented cars, who came to this home as a sort of pilgrimage almost to see the third president of the United States in his home, and had no conception of this place being a plantation or that this person was an enslaver. And I think it's a microcosm for how so many people across this country don't understand the history of slavery in any sort of meaningful way and in any way that is commensurate with the impact that it actually has had on this country.
Yeah, and as you point out, Clint, in the book, in many ways, they haven't really put a face on it. They don't really understand, that there were children involved and how they were involved. It's a fascinating read. The book is How the Word is Passed. It's on sale now. Clint Smith, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Yeah, he says just because something is difficult to accept doesn't mean you should refuse to accept it.